Hello and welcome to another episode of the Americano Show. Today we're going to be talking about Kamala Harris's choice for vice president, for the vice presidential nomination at the forthcoming convention for the Democrats in Chicago. She's picked Governor Tim Walz. We spoke to Dash Dabrowski yesterday, a young Gen Z millennial who's very enthusiastic about it. And today we're going to talk to Gerard Baker, who I'm guessing is going to be a little bit less enthusiastic, but he's a very fair-minded man. Gerard Baker is, of course, editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Jerry, I was listening to Donald Trump on Fox and Friends this morning saying how thrilled he was by this pick of a kind of radical left candidate, and he kept on saying it was a shockingly bad choice. Do you think Trump is sincere in his delight there?
Freddie, thank you very much. First of all, thanks for having me. I should quickly stress I'm editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal. I was editor-in-chief.
Editor-at-large. Sorry.
No worries. Just in case anybody thinks I've got ideas above my station, I know my place. Freddie, I mean, as ever with Trump, there is hyperbole and exaggeration and dissimulation in everything he says. But he's not actually fundamentally misleading in this. This was the pick that I think Republicans were really hoping for. Certainly the choice that they were absolutely not hoping for was Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. I spoke to a number of very senior people in the Republican Party last week, including people around the campaign. And the expectation was pretty firmly then that it would be Shapiro. And they were, frankly, alarmed. Every single one of them said more or less openly, this would be a very troubling pick. I mean, when you have a very popular governor, 64% approval rating in probably what will be the key swing state, Pennsylvania, in a very close election, that's why you would not pick that person. Well, we can probably come on to that, but is either a mystery or due to the kind of internal scheming of internal party over Democratic Party politics. So the Republicans, Trump was concerned. I'm sure he wouldn't have expressed it if it had been Shapiro, but they were definitely concerned about Shapiro. Walz of Minnesota, by contrast, I mean, it's an interesting choice because this is someone who was not really heard of, particularly a few weeks ago. I mean, for someone who supposedly is such a great figure in the Democratic Party, I don't think even 90% of Democrats could have named Tim Walz. But he is not. So Minnesota's not really a swing state, so he doesn't really help them there. And I think there are lots and lots of reasons, which we can get into, why Walz himself is, he has some strengths, clearly, but why he has many, many negatives, I think, and why he may actually detract, I think. I mean, we shouldn't overstate it because vice presidential picks don't in the end make that much difference. But I think on balance, I think it not only is it not the person, not the man that Republicans most feared it would be, who could make most difference to the election, but I think B, it's someone that they will be able to attack quite effectively and put both Kamala Harris and the ticket as a whole in a pretty unfavorable light.
Well, let's get on to the weaknesses, but let's talk first about his strengths. I mean, the obvious one is that he seems affable. He comes across well in interviews. And, historically, it was always said that, the candidate who you most want to have a beer with is most likely to win. I'm not sure whether that's always been true, but it certainly helps a lot. And he does seem to have that going in his favour. He also seems popular with children because of his background in education, although I think Republicans will attack him on that. And I think my pet theory is one of the reasons he was chosen is because he had children through IVF. And the Democrats are thinking a lot about that debate against J.D. Vance, and they really want to attack Republicans for being creepy and patriarchal and wanting to control women. And Walz will have this comeback line to Vance's very Catholic conservative theology on sex and say, I had children through IVF, you wouldn't let me have a family, and here you are talking about the family. So I think that was probably, that may have been a factor in it. So those are his strengths. Would you broadly agree with them as strengths? Are there any I'm missing out?
I do agree, Freddie. I think, and I hadn't actually particularly thought about that IVF point, and I think it is a good point. It won't be a central part of the campaign, but it gives them another attack line on JD Vance in particular. Yeah, look, I think his image certainly. I think we can pick apart that image and to some extent, because I think it might be a little bit phony, but his image is of the kind of everyman Midwesterner, bluff speaking, as you say, the kind of guy who, goes out hunting at weekends and, wears a camouflage cap and, again, the kind of guy who you can sit down with and have a beer. So that, I think that does come across. And I think that is a contrast with JD Vance. By the way, I think JD Vance is rapidly becoming one of the most unfairly maligned politicians in American history. I mean, Vance, is himself from a very, very, as everybody now knows, from a very ordinary background himself, who actually did extraordinarily well for himself. He's in many ways the model of the American dream, right? I mean, I thought one thing that was curious in some ways about Walz attacking Vance last night at the rally in Philadelphia, saying, he went to Yale and he, got lots of money from Silicon Valley and he wrote a book about how terrible his upbringing was. I mean, that is kind of the American dream there, right? Exactly right there. He did grow up in relative poverty and he did pull himself up and he's done extraordinarily well. So I think Vance is incredibly maligned. But you're right, broadly, I think that is... that's certainly the image that Democrats will want to project, and we can get into the extent to which it masks, I think, some pretty kind of hardcore left-wing positions that he's taken as governor of Minnesota.
And one thing I left out also is he has quite strong backing from the unions, and that could be very important in swing states. And for Americano listeners who don't really follow American politics closely, but perhaps you could help us understand how Midwestern states, the unions are kind of the secret source of winning elections, or have been for a long time, and Vance and Walz are both playing into that.
Very much so. Yeah, so a lot of it is about organization. In some ways, I think we can see this pick, and we'll get into this probably when we talk about the issues. I think in many ways this choice is part of and this may be accurate. I'm not convinced it is, but this may be very smart on Harris's part, is a recognition that this election, like so many elections these days, comes down not to swing voters, but to mobilizing the base, enthusing the base, enthusing those voters who are, to come out and vote. I mean, there's no question that the problem the Democrats had 2 months ago with Joe Biden was a large number of voters were just not enthused to come out and vote for Joe Biden. That's changed. We've seen this with these extraordinary energy that Harris is able to bring. And I think Walz he doubles down on that. And the point about the unions is a good one, which is, they are, they raise a huge amount of money for Democratic candidates. B, they have a deep organization in many of these critical sort of industrial state or post-industrial states where they can actually help to, in very, very significant numbers, bring people out to vote, especially in an age of absentee ballots and early voting and all of that. So yeah, it does give them, it definitely, the union angle does give them some significant strength. And as I say, it does also enthuse people where there was previously torpor and apathy. So yeah, there are lots of reasons there, I think, as well, why organizationally this pick makes sense. I've been a little bit baffled by this idea that he will bring, notwithstanding what I just said, that he somehow appeals to voters broadly across the Midwest. And that's going to be, and remember, those are the three critical states in this election are almost certainly going to be Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, as we've already talked about Pennsylvania. I think the idea that someone from Minnesota appeals naturally to someone from Michigan or Wisconsin, I think that's a little bit overstated, particularly, back to my original point, it's not like having the popular governor of a state that is itself in play, as it would have been the case with Shapiro, rather having a neighboring governor, somehow channeling or representing or appealing to that kind of white working class vote, which will be so important in this election. I'm a little bit skeptical that the governor of Minnesota is going to shift, as the vice presidential nominee, is going to shift huge number of voters in Michigan or Wisconsin, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, and in fairness, I suppose Republicans were saying the same about Vance, saying, yes, he's from Ohio.
I never bought that either.
You never bought
I thought
that
he's going to appeal in Western Pennsylvania. I never thought that was particularly strong. Yeah.
Well, let's get on to Walz's other possible weaknesses, because weaknesses are always more fun to discuss. I think the thing that Republicans are already going after is that he sounds moderate, but he is very much not moderate. His record over Black Lives Matter is a particular highlight for them. He let Minneapolis burn. Do you get the impression that on that and other issues they will be able to portray him as this kind of woke wolf in moderate sheep clothing?
I do. Yes, I think that's exactly right. Exactly the point. That look, I mean, the question to ask of all those people who say, "Hey, he's just this good old boy, regular guy from the Midwest who likes a beer and takes his dog hunting, and was a teacher and football coach and all that kind of stuff." The thing to ask them is, on what policy areas, in what matters of actual substance, does he differ in any way from not just Kamala Harris, but Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or indeed any of those other people? It's one thing to kind of have the affect, which he clearly does, of a kind of regular guy, but he supports all the same policies, and not just supports, but as actually, as you say, Freddie in Minnesota has implemented and indeed championed the very same policies that are well to the left of where most people are. You talked about the way he behaved over the Black Lives Matter protests, which of course obviously all started in Minnesota after the murder of George Floyd. But we can talk about his attitude towards transgender policies towards transgender children. We can talk about very extreme policies on abortion. Minnesota, again, abortion is generally speaking a topic that helps Democrats, but he signed into law abortion legislation that would allow abortion pretty well up to the moment of birth. He's extreme on that. He was extreme on COVID rules implementation, including encouraging neighbors to snitch on their other people that they saw walking in the park without a mask. He on every single one of these issues, Freddie, he doesn't differ in, as far as I can tell, we'll see more, maybe he'll be pressed on this, he doesn't differ in a single iota from these very, very left-wing positions, as I say, that not only Kamala Harris supports, but the very left wing of the Democratic Party. And I think in many ways, and that's what I was sort of hinting at the beginning when I said I think this pick is a kind of doubling down by Harris, not only in terms of mobilizing the Democratic base, but actually essentially turning the Democratic Party into the party of Bernie Sanders. It's just an astonishing thing that 8 years ago, when Bernie Sanders was running against Hillary Clinton, Sanders was ultimately defeated. It was a close run thing, but he was ultimately defeated because the party wanted to appeal to moderate voters. Hillary appealed to more moderate voters than Sanders is. The party is now the kind of Bernie Sanders plus party. And Walz absolutely in policy terms emphasizes that.
I suppose the fear then for Republicans might be that would Bernie Sanders have beaten Donald Trump if he'd been the nominee instead of Hillary Clinton?
I mean, I've always wondered that. I mean, they obviously both appeal to working class voters. I mean, I think perhaps the core difference between Bernie Sanders now and the mainstream of the Democratic Party is he is still probably more animated by issues that concern working class voters. He's still much more focused on economic issues. In particular, he's still very very supportive of, strongly redistributive tax measures, tough measures against big business, against Wall Street and everything else. Whereas, he supports all the kind of woke cultural left agenda too, but he emphasizes that more. And I do think, by the way, that, I think Sanders would have had probably a better chance against Hillary because he did identify with those working class views. In the last 8 years, those economic issues have been trumped, give the pun, by the cultural issues. And in some ways, Bernie Sanders' saliency has diminished because he's still, again, more associated with the economic issues. But in terms of where the broad party is, the party has moved so far to the left, as I say, that Sanders in some ways now, because of his emphasis on the economic issues, almost seems like, if anything, he's kind of in the middle of the party rather than on the left of the party.
Let's go back to Shapiro briefly, because I wanted to get your view on this question of Gaza, and a lot of speculation that one, if not the main reason, Shapiro was not picked was because he's Jewish and because he's been very vocal in his support of Israel in the war, over the war in Gaza. Walz is no Hamas sympathizer. He seems to have been very openly and publicly pro-Israel. So it's not a pick like that. But the fact that Shapiro wasn't picked suggests maybe he just wasn't picked because he's Jewish. And there were various Democratic commentators suggesting that last night.
I think that's absolutely true. Look, I spoke to, and by the way, I do think this was a last-minute switch. I'm convinced that I spoke to several Democrats. I'm not, deeply sourced in the Democratic Party, but as it happens, I do have a couple of good sources who are very close to Kamala Harris, and I've spent the weekend over a very lengthy dinner with someone who is very, very close to Kamala Harris on Saturday night, and the word was Friday night actually, and he had been speaking to Harris and he'd spoken to Shapiro, and he was 90% convinced that it was going to be Shapiro. But he did acknowledge, and it's obviously become very clear in the last few days, that there was tremendous pushback against that from the left of the party, particularly the sort of the pro-Hamas wing of the party. And they're now kind of making up stories about Shapiro wanted too much of a role in, policy, and so they couldn't give it to him, and that's why she changed her mind. But I'm absolutely convinced it was because of because of Shapiro's identification with a very strongly pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist line. They were unearthing things that he'd written, as a child virtually, that were sort of strongly critical of Palestine and two-state solution and all this kind of stuff. And I think, Freddie, you're absolutely right. You're right. It's not hard to discern exactly how Tim Walz differs in policy terms from Shapiro on that, and you're forced to ask the question then: why was Shapiro such a problem? Why were his pro-Zionist views such a problem in the party? If his name had been Joe Smith or Franco Angeletti or something, would he with exactly the same views? Would he have had the same problems? I really doubt it. I think it is, frankly, and you're right, there's some prominent kind of Democratic commentators, Van Jones particularly, picked up on this in the last couple of days. You're left with the inevitable conclusion that it was because he's Jewish that he couldn't get that job. And again, I come back to my point. I think this is why we're hearing these stories, these sort of cover stories from the Harris campaign. That no, it was he was demanding too much of a role for the vice president. In the end, he wasn't really sure whether he really wanted to do it. I don't believe that for a second. Of course, he wanted to do it, and of course, anybody in that position is in a supplicatory position. They're not going to go in and start making demands in order for them to do the job. They'll do the job, more or less if they're told they have to walk the dog every day, because it's such an opportunity to elevate yourself in American politics. I just don't believe that. And I believe they're making up stories to cover for the fact that he didn't get the role primarily because he's Jewish.
Mm. And so do you think that perhaps they were thinking, just sort of strategically as far as the election is concerned, Pennsylvania's looking pretty bad for us, Michigan is looking quite bad for us, but we could win Michigan if we don't go too hard pro-Israel, because of the large Arab vote in Michigan, and so they sort of perhaps junked Pennsylvania for Michigan in their minds.
Yeah, again, I think that is kind of weighing more or less a certainty against a possibility. I think if Shapiro had been on the ticket, I think it's a near certainty. But who knows what can happen in the next 3 months? But a near certainty that they would win Pennsylvania. Whereas, maybe assuaging a little bit of that Arab American opinion helps them possibly in Michigan. By the way, it's also worth noting, of course, Minnesota, where Walz is, in the Minnesota primary early in the year, Minnesota Democratic primary early in the year, Minnesota, a very significant number of voters who voted uncommitted, again, i.e. against Joe Biden, almost as many, I think, maybe even more than there were in Michigan, a similar number as there were in Michigan. And these were, again, very much pro-Palestinian voters, very unhappy with Joe Biden's policies in support of Israel. So, and Minnesota, of course, is where Tim Walz is from, and it does also have a fairly significant Arab and certainly kind of pro-Palestinian population. So, yeah, I think there's an element of that. But I think the larger issue, I don't think it was an electoral calculus with Shapiro. I think it was simply they couldn't risk the public display of disunity that there would have been, both with the announcement of Shapiro and with coming up with the convention in a couple of weeks, the kind of protest that I think the anti-Zionist, let's call it what it is, anti-Semitic protest that I think we would likely have seen. I think they just couldn't risk and they were warned, I think Harris was warned that picking Shapiro would spark that kind of display of disunity, and they just didn't want to take that risk.
And, of course, events. I mean, I think Harris and Walz will probably try and speak quite sotto voce about the Middle East in the coming weeks and at the convention, because they don't want to upset Jewish voters and they don't want to upset their Hamas-supporting voters. But I think it's probably fair to say that, with tensions simmering so much in the Middle East, I mean, there could be a situation where by the time you get to Chicago, there's open exchange of hostilities between, even more open exchange of hostilities between Iran and Israel. And they're going to have to talk about it, and that will be difficult for them.
I think it will. And look, I don't think we should. Again, you're absolutely right. They will try and keep some sort of veneer of, let's say, sort of moderate, sort of a moderate approach. They'll keep saying things that the very few things that Harris has said, which is Israel has a right to defend itself, but of course, it's doing, it's overreached in Gaza, and it's creating the risk of destabilizing the wider Middle East. They'll keep that kind of diplomatic line. But yeah, I think, if you look at Kamala Harris's record, if you look, by the way, just most recently, her refusal to attend Benjamin Netanyahu's address to Congress 2 weeks ago, that's a pretty extraordinary thing. Now, again, you don't have to agree with Netanyahu. A lot of people don't. And I know a lot of very strongly pro-Israel people, and indeed Israelis, strongly disagree with Netanyahu. But this was the leader of a key ally, like him or not, coming to address Congress at a moment of continuing crisis for that country. She took herself off because she had a prior engagement to address a college sorority. That to me was not an accident. That was intended to send a very clear signal, both about Netanyahu, but more broadly to those in her party and those who would support her party, who are profoundly anti-Israel and would actually like to see the US tilt in a much more aggressive way against Israel in the Middle East. So I think, they'll try and gloss over, but they will at the same time, signal these little, nods of the head here to the extremists among themselves that fundamentally they're on their side. I think that's the way. And by the way, I don't think that's a fake thing. I think they fundamentally are on their side, and I think that probably will quiet the anger that you would have seen, certainly if Shapiro had been on the ticket, and the demonstrations that you would have seen if Shapiro had been on the ticket. And I think they can probably succeed in glossing over the internal tensions that they clearly have over the issue.
Although I did see a poll, I think it came out yesterday, showing Trump ahead with Jews all across America, which is quite striking, really, is it not?
It's revolutionary. I mean, Jews have tended ever since polling began to be progressive, lean left, progressive, in ways you would expect. And for the first, you're absolutely right. For the first time ever, we could see Jews voting for a Republican, a majority of Jews voting for a Republican. And I speak to people, including people who are still Democrats and are still, minded to support, but really, really can't stand Donald Trump for all the reasons that we're kind of familiar with, but who are seriously saying, I may have to either not vote or vote Republican, sort of swallow hard and vote Republican, because I just think this Democratic Party is staking out a position now that is actually hostile to Israel. In this moment of an incredible existential crisis for the country, the Democratic Party is led by people who are sending these messages that it's not really supportive. So I think we are seeing a major shift there. And look, that won't be electorally that significant because Jews, the Jews don't make up a huge overall proportion of the vote, obviously. But even in the states where they do, New York, Florida, they're pretty safe states either way. It could make a small difference. It could make a fairly significant number in Pennsylvania. If New Jersey were to be in play, they could make a difference there. But it doesn't look like they'll make a difference in terms of the outcome of the election. But in terms of where this, I think, tells us about where domestic politics are going, and a key support constituency for the Democrats, how that's eroding. I think that's a really significant. That's of real significance.
Let's talk a bit about Trump and what's happened since Kamala Harris has ascended to the top of the ticket within Trump world, because we now read reports about meltdowns. Politico, I think it was either yesterday or today, was saying that Republican strategists are saying he's having a public breakdown. That I'm always a bit skeptical when I read that, because we've been hearing that Donald Trump's been having a breakdown for the last 8 years. But he has been, but
it hasn't really affected his electoral.
But he could just keep going, yeah. But I think that it does seem like his behaviour has gotten back to being pretty erratic in the last few days. There was this attack on Governor Kemp in Georgia, and his truth socialing has probably amplified its craziness a little bit. What's your assessment of what's going on there?
There's real concern among Republicans I speak to about this. There was this absurd, I frankly thought it absurd idea that after the assassination attempt, Trump was a changed man, had his brush with mortality and was now going to turn into this sort of thoughtful, reflective person intent on unifying and harmonizing the country. I thought it was complete and utter nonsense. And sure enough, it is. You're right, Freddie. I mean, in the last week, we've had... I think, well, let me just say what we've had. We've had first of all, the silly and pointless. And again, I'm channeling here senior Republican views who are very alarmed about this. We had the silly and pointless stuff about whether or not Kamala Harris was really black when he spoke to the National Association of Black Journalists last week. We had this bizarre and ridiculous attack on the very popular Republican governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, who he blames for costing him the election in Georgia in 2020. And then, this, again, another absolutely unhinged rant on Truth Social last night, suggesting that Joe Biden was going to come storming back and take back the Democratic nomination. And, he was getting ready for this. I mean, this is Trump. This is Trump won, Trump 2016 revive us, and it's alarming people. And I think it speaks to a larger problem that Trump has right now and the Republicans have, which is that they have been completely blindsided. They shouldn't have been, because I think, the prospect that Biden was going to be kicked off the ticket was very high after that debate performance. But they have been blindsided completely by this, and they do not have a strategy. He doesn't see, well, maybe they have a strategy, but Trump doesn't seem to reflect it, to deal with the changed circumstances of a Democratic Party, which is resurgent again, uniting in very impressive form, one has to say, behind Kamala Harris, who in every respect is a completely vacuous and vapid political figure. But they haven't decided what the attack line is. Is the attack line that she is vacuous and vapid, which is, I would think, would be the most productive one? Is it something to do with her skin color? Is it something to do with the fact that she doesn't have any natural born children? Is it something to do with, the fact that she's, got where she is thanks to DEI or something else? I mean, all of those things we can have a very interesting, discussion about whether the validity of those things. It's not registering at all with the public. We have a different election. We have an energized Democratic Party united around a candidate, and now a vice presidential candidate, and Trump has not made that adjustment yet. I don't think it's too late by any means. The Democrats are going to have another really good week and a half, 2 weeks here. They're going to have this rollout of the vice presidential pick. They're going to go off campaigning for the next few days. That will get, as you've already seen, this adulatory coverage that it's getting. They'll get more of that. Then we'll have, in 2 weeks' time, the convention where, we'll have Joe Biden night, and all those people who were knifing Joe Biden 2 weeks ago will now be celebrating him and claiming he needs to be installed on Mount Rushmore, followed by, 3 days of the arrival of the second coming in the form of Kamala Harris. They're going to get all that. So they're going to come out of that convention at the end of August, probably with she's already got a small lead in the polls, maybe even a slightly larger lead. Then probably panic. Then that might be the time to panic in the Republican Party. But I still think even at that point, if they focus on Harris's record, the complete reversal she seems to have done on every single issue that matters, and the record of the Biden-Harris administration, which is very unpopular. This is the key thing to remember, is that the polling ratings for Biden and Harris have been in the basement for the last year, thanks to prices and immigration and the global insecurity that we're seeing. If they get back on track, if Trump can simply get back on track and making the case, the issue, the election one about, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Were you better off under me as president than you are under Biden, or likely to be under Harris? I think they still have a chance. But right now, Trump is, the campaign is disoriented. Trump is back to his worst excesses, and there is a fair amount of trouble, I think it's fair to say.
Do you think possibly what Trump's doing is he feels on defense, to say it the way the Americans say it? He's on defense. He's trying to get back on offense because and so he's just firing out attacks and seeing if any of them stick. And do you think also perhaps Trump's attempt to be the sort of right-wing Gandhi at the convention don't work because it so ill suits him Nobody believes it. And he going back to his sort of the original Trump, and particularly a Trump who's fighting with senior Republicans, is quite attractive to a lot of voters who might not vote at all. A lot, in Georgia, obviously you're going to upset a lot of conservative Georgians, but they'll probably come around in the end anyway to Trump, particularly as Harris is the opponent. But what you might get is those people who never voted before, often African Americans who've never voted before.
Remember the Gandhi Trump, as you describe it, the sort of karma chameleon Trump lasted about 20 minutes in that speech at the convention, that ridiculously long hour and a half speech. The first 20 minutes sounded quite good. The next 70 minutes were the usual, campaign shtick, nonsense, drivel, attacking his opponents, self-indulgent stuff. So we had plenty of evidence there that this transformation had not exactly taken hold. Look, I think the thing with Trump, there's no point, and people have been saying for 8-9 years now, if only Donald Trump, Donald Trump's got a powerful message, people feel disenfranchised, alienated from, disrespected by the elites in the country, and the Democratic Party absolutely represents those elites. And Trump comes along, and he's brilliantly able, better than any other politician, able to channel all that. Let him do that. If only he would cut out the kind of, whether it used to be tweets, now it's truth socials, the personal attacks, the kind of weird digressions into, bizarre stories. That's always seemed to me to be a completely absurd criticism, because that is Trump, right? That's the whole thing. It's kind of like saying, a horse would be so much more, so much faster as a mode of transportation if you could put an engine in it. You know what I mean? It's just that is just the animal. It's just who he is. And I think when it's when the Democrats have a candidate in Joe Biden who's enormously unpopular and nobody really thinks can do another 4 years, Trump can get away with that because the desire for change is so strong, and again, the emphasis on his ability to connect with ordinary people is so strong that they kind of ignore the dross that we have to put up with. But when the circumstances are changed, the dross gets all the attention again, and it just doesn't really work in terms of attacking the opposition. Look, so I'm not expecting at all in the next 3 months Trump to suddenly become this disciplined figure who's going to focus relentlessly day after day after day on Harris's weakness. He's not going to do that. He's going to do what he's always done. But if they can at least get the election was always, Freddie, as you well know as well as I, this election was always going to be about. It wasn't. I think the Democrats have done a pretty good job in the last 2 weeks of seeming to make this a very positive campaign and looking energized and all of that. But this election was always going to come down to who voters dislike more, right? And it was Biden for a long time. They disliked both candidates, but they certainly they'd somewhat disliked Biden more than they disliked Trump. Now we have a less dislikable candidate, or let's be honest, less well-known candidate, a bit of a kind of a shimmerer in the shape of Kamala Harris, and we've still got this very dislikable Republican. So they've now shifted to, on balance, disliking Trump more than they dislike Harris. If the job he's got to do in the next 3 months is once again to get the public attention back on Harris, back on the administration's record for the last 4 years, back on her personal political positions, extreme left-wing positions. I still believe they can do that. And frankly, if I still was putting money on it today, I still think that will be the decisive factor in the election. But there's no question that Trump's the way in which, and helped by the media, obviously, because the media are going to push this every single crazy thing that Trump says very hard, and we're not going to hear anything about Kamala Harris's many crazy things that she said in the past. Trump, they've got to hope that in the next 3 months, the balance of they've got to hope and indeed try to make sure that the balance of the election debate is about the Democrats and not about Donald Trump. If this is an election about Donald Trump, as it was in 2020, he will lose. So they've got to get the public conversation onto Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party and the Democratic administration if they are to have a chance of winning.
Is it partly because of this thing that Democrats are very excited about, which is calling Trump and Vance and Trump supporters weird? And it seems to me that it's a very sort of childish playground taunt thing to do. But the reason Democrats are so excited about it is they feel that they've got a kind of Trumpy ability to troll the opposition now, which Trump has always specialized in.
Yeah, I do think. I think there's something to that. Look, again, I find this idea that I mean, who's more weird? You know, we can argue about, you know, whether it's weird to, you know, to believe in. As by the way, as the US still does, unlike the UK, that, you know, there's, you know, some states in this country have, you know, rules that prevent parents from being consulted when their teenage child decides that they want to change gender. Is that normal, or is that weird? I think most Americans, we can argue about it, but I think most Americans would find that weird. So a lot of the positions that Democrats have are downright weird. At the same time, it is fairly easy to caricature. I mean, it's not difficult when Trump goes off, as he did on Truth Social last night, with his rant about how Joe Biden is going to come storming back into the race. That's pretty weird. A lot of these things that Trump does are weird. J.D. Vance, who I think, again, I said earlier, has been unfairly maligned, has undoubtedly also, unfortunately, and, you know, by being a kind of an interesting person, an interesting character who says, you know, kind of provocative things, again, whether it's, you know, childless cat ladies or something else, can be characterized as weird. So I think they are onto something there. There is just something a little bit out of the mainstream of these two candidates. But again, I think that's why I think that Republicans have got to get the issue back on to the issues. I think, again, if it comes down to personality, this has always been Trump's problem. Trump, and even Trump supporters, except for the most hardcore Trump supporters, you'll always find people who vote for Trump saying, I wish he wouldn't say some of these crazy things, but I'm going to vote for him anyway. And if it's just the crazy things, and it's Trump can, you know, be doing crazy things, and if the other candidate is not an 82-year-old man who most people don't think is even going to live for another few years, but a kind of, you know, a blank slate, which is still, in the view of most voters, largely what Kamala Harris is. If it's a kind of a blank slate, generic person, Democrat, against this sort of crazy person, then that is going to be a problem. That is the problem for Trump. That's why he's got to define Kamala Harris, got to turn this election into a referendum on the Democratic administration and that she represents, and by the way, which she said almost nothing about so far. They've got, if they can get it onto that, then they've got a good chance of getting it off the topic of Donald Trump's craziness. But if it's about Donald Trump's craziness, then I think they lose.
Gerard Baker, thank you very much for coming on to Americano. It's always fascinating to hear your insights, and I do hope we'll get you on again soon.
Thanks, Freddy. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for listening to that episode of The Americano Show. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave rave reviews on whatever platform you listen to it on. I would like to thank, of course, my brilliant producer, Natasha Feroz. And I'd also like to point out that we're going to go to Chicago the week after next for the Democratic National Convention. And I would urge you, if you have any suggestions for what kind of podcasts we should do, what kind of shows we should produce while we're out there, to get in touch with podcasts@spectator.co.uk, or indeed feel free to DM on X, formerly Twitter, either Natasha Feroz. What's your handle, Natasha? Natasha Feroz. Or me, Freddy Gray. My handle, I think, is Freddy Gray 31, and we will gratefully receive any ideas. Thanks again for listening. All the best.